In this video, we want to go through factoring strategies. In other words, we want to be able to kind of figure out how to factor a problem without being given any sort of direction. We're going to see a problem and kind of figure out what technique to use. So, all the factoring that we've learned up to this point, I just want to kind of list it out so we can kind of examine it as a whole here. The first technique we learned was greatest common factor, or GCF, wow, greatest common factor, also known as the GCF. And then we talked about factor by grouping. Then we discussed the X method. And then technically we discussed perfect square trinomials, but we used the X method on perfect square trinomials. So the last method we kind of learned was difference of squares. So when we are factor by grouping, we have to have at least 4 terms. And we're doing the X method, that means we're factoring a trinomial, which is 3 terms. And with difference of squares, we did that with, it had to be 2 terms. And the only one that doesn't have a requirement of how many terms is the greatest common factor. We could do this with any of the problems, which means when we are doing factoring, we should always check for this. Always check to see if it might possibly have a GCF. And then we'll kind of proceed based on how many terms there are and then try to factor it further from there. So that's our strategy. We're going to go forward here. Okay, so I see this first example and I'm like, all right, lots of terms going on. I want to see if I could possibly factor something out. Since all of the numbers are even, I know they're divisible by 2, but let's first see if they're divisible by 4. All right, so they are. So if I factor out a 4, I'm just using my calculator to do this. I'm left with x squared. Okay, so 56 divided by 4 is 14. xy. Okay, so I'm noticing that the last term only has a y and the first term has an x, so I can't factor out any x's or y's. Only 4. And then 196 divided by 4, that's a 49. Okay. And then the y squared, it's got to stay. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and factor this using the X method because I have 3 terms. So at the top of the X is going to be 49. Bottom of the X is going to be 14. So 2 numbers that multiply to be 49 but add to be 14. That's 7 and 7. So I'm going to ignore the GCF right now. And I'm going to go ahead and just factor this in the parentheses here. So x squared, and instead of 14, I'm going to write 7xy plus 7xy, and I'm grabbing that from over here. And then bringing down the 49y squared. That's funny. Let me erase the green. There we go. Okay. So now I'm going to factor by grouping. Out of the first group, I can factor out just x. And I'm left with x plus 7y. Second group, I could factor out a 7 and a y, and that'll leave me with x plus 7y. Okay, so there's my blob, x plus 7y times x plus 7y, so it's a perfect square trinomial, which I knew because this was the same number twice back up here. But then I don't want to forget the 4 that I had for my GCF at the beginning. So I want to make sure I bring that 4 down. So this, I could write my answer this way, or I could go ahead and write it as a perfect square. So I could write 4 times, x plus 7y squared. Either way is good. All right, let's try another one. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to check for GCF. And I definitely see that 5 goes into all of the numbers. And I'm also, it looks like X as well goes into everything. Everything has an X. Okay, so I'm going to factor out 5X. In the first term, let's see, I'll be left with XY. And in the second term, I'm left with a 3Y. Third term, I'm left with a 7X. And then 105 is 21 and no X at all. Okay, so that's what I'm left with. So what I'm going to do now, I notice I have 4 terms. So that means I should try grouping. So I'm going to ignore the 5X. I'm just going to focus on what's here in the parentheses, and I'm going to group the first 2 terms and then group the second 2 terms. And if you want, you may want to rewrite it if the 5 is kind of distracting, but I'm just going to ignore it. So, okay, so in the first group, I can factor out a y. And I'm left with x plus 3. In the second group, -7. And that's going to leave me with x plus 3 because I'm factoring out the negative, so that becomes a positive. So my blob is x plus 3 times y minus 7. And then I want to bring down the GCF here of 5x. And there it is. That's the final answer. All right, let's look at this one. We definitely have a GCF of 100. So that's going to leave me with m squared minus 4. Okay, and now what's in the parentheses is 2 terms, which I'm hoping is a difference of squares, and it is. So this is going to factor into m minus 2 times m plus 2, right? Because 2 squared is 4. And then I want to bring down the 100 here, the GCF, not forget that in my final answer. All right, let's try another one. Okay, so for this one, I don't really have a GCF, but I do notice that the first number is negative. And when we talked about GCF, we talked about how if the first number is negative, we should factor it out. So you could think of it as factoring out a -1 or just a negative, which would basically just change all the signs. So this is going to become a 36w squared minus 13w plus 1. And now I'm just going to leave that -1 out in the front. And again, I'm okay with you writing a -1. I'm just going to write it as a negative, but same difference. Okay, if you want to put a 1 there, if that like feels better. All right. Okay, so let's factor what's inside. I see we have 3 terms, so we're going to use the x method. And at the top of the x is going to be 36 times 1 is 36. Bottom of the x is -13. So 2 numbers that multiply to be 36, but add to be -13. Well, that's -9 and -4. So this is going to be, I'm going to ignore the negative out in the front. So 36w squared minus 9w minus 4w plus 1. I'm going to factor by grouping now. And out of the first group, I can factor out a 9w, which will leave me with 4w minus 1, because the 9w, when you factor that out, it leaves a 1, right? 9w divided by 9w is 1. Anything divided by itself is 1. Okay, in the second group, I actually can't really factor out anything. I can factor out a negative. So I can factor out a -1 because that leading number is negative. So that's going to leave me with 4w. And then that's going to change this to -1. So there's our blob. 4w minus 1 times 9w minus 1. And then we have a -1 out in the front as a GCF, which I'm just going to write as a negative, but you could write the 1. It's okay. And there you go. That would be the final answer on that. All right, let's try another one. Okay, so let's see. I'm wondering, I think 11 might work. 550 divided by 11. Yes, it works. Okay, so let's see. I could definitely pull out an 11. In fact, I think because if I factor out 11 from 550, sorry, yeah, 550, I'm left with 50. And that means actually, I think I could pull out more. I think I could pull out 22. All right, let's see. 550 divided by 22. Yep, it works. Okay, so here we go. I can factor out a 22. And then looking at the variables, okay, so they both have b in common. And since this one has a single b to the 1, I can factor out a b. Okay, so that leaves me with 4a squared plus, and that's 25b squared. Okay, and now what's in here, I have two terms, so I can try difference of squares, but actually, difference of squares isn't going to work because this isn't a negative. It has to be a negative in order for it to work, and it's not, it's a positive. So this is done. This is the final answer. All I could do is factor out a GCF in that case. But sometimes they like to put it into the form where you're like, oh, they're both perfect squares, so maybe I could factor it further. I can't because it's a plus sign. That's as factored as that's going to be.